All right. Well, thanks for unpacking that. And unless there are other questions, I'm gonna turn it over um, to Pat Farrar from the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Pat studies the dynamics of carbon storage and plant diversity in response to climate change, human development, and restoration efforts, over time. And he focuses on forests, grasslands, shrublands on Martha's Vineyard, and retired cranberry bogs throughout southeastern Mass, amongst other things that I'm aware that he does. Pat, thanks for joining us this morning, and we thought it'd be a good opportunity to educate us a little bit more on some of the plant diversity efforts and analyses that you've been involved with and that Woodwell has been tracking inside Manuel Correllus. I'm going to I'll make you a co-host here so you have the ability to share your screen.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me.
Should be all set.
Okay, great. How does that look for everybody?
Excellent.
Colorful.
All right, great. All right, so yep, I'm Patrick Farrar. Pat, I'm a research assistant at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. And yeah, today I'm going to be talking with you a bit about some of the plant biodiversity in Correllus. So, myself here. So I want to start off just by talking about plant biodiversity in New England a little more generally. So a lot of diversity occurs in patch habitats that don't necessarily occupy large areas of the landscape, but they have disproportionate numbers of rare species. So maintaining these patch habitats is really critical for sustaining regional biodiversity. And this idea is really nicely encapsulated in this 2021 report by the Native Plant Trust and the Nature Conservancy, pictured on the right there. So many of these patch habitats are early successional ecosystems. They're created and maintained by disturbances like fire, mowing, grazing. In our region, disturbance of the forest ecosystems that would predominate in the absence of disturbance. So because these habitats are early successional, they have lower stocks of carbon in that they're above ground vegetation than later successional habitats like, say, mature forests. Large trees and other woody vegetation stores a lot of carbon in the wood. So this creates a trade-off between promoting regional biodiversity and maximizing carbon storage everywhere. So kind of circle back to that later. But Correllus is one such example of a high biodiversity patch habitat. It contains a few hundred acres of more open grasslands and heathlands, primarily in the form of fire breaks that I'll discuss shortly. As far as plant biodiversity is concerned, these are really the hotspots in Correllus, so that's going to be more of my focus today. But the vast contiguous areas of scrub oak and oak pitch pine barrens, which are a globally rare habitat type, are extremely important for animal biodiversity, especially insects, as I understand Matt Pelican is going to discuss in much greater depth soon. So the state forest contains this network of fire breaks, as you can see in forming a grid in the aerial imagery of part of the forest on the right there. So these are wide paths that are maintained by mowing and brush cutting, et cetera, to serve as open areas that would hopefully prevent a wildfire from spreading out of control within the forest and allow for fire trucks and equipment to get around within the forest. The Correllus and the fire breaks within are very important for plant biodiversity regionally. Margaret Curtin, who's a renowned naturalist on Martha's Vineyard, has compiled a list of 294 plant species found within the state forest. And the Biodiversity Works and Friends of Correllus iNaturalist project for the state forest has photo submissions of 322 different plant species there. And according to the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, Correllus has one of the highest concentrations of state-listed rare species in the Commonwealth. So, as I mentioned earlier, as far as plant diversity is concerned, the fire breaks are really the heavy hitters. Mowing and removal or brush cutting of the woody vegetation there to maintain the fire breaks has created a disturbance regime and open habitat that supports really high plant biodiversity. And it creates refugia for many rare plants, such as the endangered species pictured on the right here. The Margaret's plant species list included 23 rare species, 22 of which occur in the fire breaks and other open areas. And a team led by Mike Whittemore, who used to steward the Nature Conservancy's properties on the vineyard, recently analyzed the floras of 64 sandplain grassland and heathland sites from Long Island to Maine. And they identified that the fire breaks alone in Correllus contain 30 rare plant species and have the second highest floristic quality index of any of their study sites, which basically indicates that they have a very high concentration of specialized rare species. So zooming out from Correllus for a moment, there are widespread concerns about declining biodiversity more generally. And so my supervisor, senior scientist Chris Neal at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, jumped on an opportunity to study plant biodiversity change across Martha's Vineyard. In 2022, my colleague Julia Charest and I, on the left there, resurveyed about 100 large vegetation plots around Martha's Vineyard in lots of different habitat types, in forests, scrub oak barrens, other shrublands, grasslands, and coastal habitats that were part of a large regional survey done by the Harvard Forest back in the year 2000. So they were initially surveyed in 2000 and we resurveyed them in 2022. And 25 of those vegetation plots were in the forests and scrub oak barrens of Correllus. And here's something that we found. Island-wide, across all these different habitat types, plant diversity declined from 2000 to 2022. So the S on the y-axis of this graph here is just the mean amount of different plant species that we found in our plots in these different habitat types. So the trend is that these are decreasing from 2000 to 2022. We're losing plant diversity. And so the causes of these declines are not exactly clear, but given the very high density of white-tailed deer on the island and existing studies about deer impacts on plant biodiversity, I want to suggest that it's possible that deer could have something to do with these losses. I'll also point out that grasslands had the highest species richness of any habitat type in both years, and were the only habitat that actually did not have a statistically significant decrease in their species richness over that time frame. So that would likely be because these grasslands are early successional patch habitats that are intentionally managed with disturbance for biodiversity by conservation organizations. So this summer, Chris and I were contracted by the Nature Conservancy to establish new vegetation monitoring plots or resurvey existing ones at 4 grassland sites and 1 scrub oak site on Martha's Vineyard that the Nature Conservancy owns and or manages. And this figure on the left, this figure on the left shows how plant biodiversity is being sustained over time at the 2 grassland sites with historical vegetation data going back to the late 90s or early 2000s. These are sites that have been mowed, intentionally burned, brush cut, and treated for non-native invasive species over that time frame. And the take-home message here is that this work pays off as far as plant biodiversity is concerned. So I want to link back to the biodiversity carbon trade-off that I brought up in the beginning. The fire breaks in Correllus total about 300 of the 5,300 acres or so, about 6% of the area. If the goal was to maximize carbon storage in Correllus, we might imagine a scenario in which all the fire breaks grow up to be mature oak pine woodlands. I mean, I know from a fire risk mitigation standpoint, that wouldn't be practical, but leaving that aside for a second, this scenario would increase the carbon stock of the island's oak pine woodlands by 1 or 2%. Meanwhile, all the rare plants that occur in the fire breaks and rarely, if ever, in the other areas of Correllus would likely be lost or at least substantially decline. So I wish to illustrate the point that it's worthwhile to consider the magnitude of the biodiversity and carbon in question when weighing these types of trade-offs in management. So wrapping up, we know that the fire breaks in Correllus harbor extraordinary plant biodiversity, including many rare and specialized species of conservation concern. We know that managing open habitats with disturbance is doing a pretty good job of sustaining plant diversity elsewhere on the island. And we know that monitoring vegetation plots on the island over time can provide a wealth of information about how plant communities and diversity are changing. So it would be great to have permanently marked vegetation plots in these fire breaks to add them to the existing network of vegetation plots on the island, establish a rigorous scientific baseline understanding of these plant communities, and create a path forward for monitoring their health over time. It would also be great to consider creating some deer exclosure experiments in Correllus or elsewhere on the island so that deer impacts on plant communities can be explicitly and rigorously tested there. And lastly, I would like to say that there's really great human community engagement with biodiversity going on in Correllus with things like the iNaturalist project and bioblitzes and forest walks. So clearly the community is really invested in the forest, which is wonderful. And these efforts are really valuable, and it'd be great for them to continue. So with that, I can leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions or comments, and there's my contact information.
Thank you, Pat. That was great.
Sure thing.
For starters, I'll open it up to the team and DCR if there are any questions for you.
Dan, am I on or not? Bob Woodruff.
You're on, Bob. Go for it.
Hey, Pat, it's good to see you, and thank you ever so much. The Friends of Correllus, having been the agency or part of the whole picture here, that got the grant from Edie to do your work in the forest. We're just delighted that there it is. Is there anything we can get as a small report, Pat? That would be very helpful in our enlightenment of the community about what you just presented.
Sure. So which information exactly?
Well, I think a sort of popular piece of writing, which is what you just presented, kind of, with a little more science than maybe the average person in the street wants to hear. But however we can convey to anything you can do that would help us convey to the public and through our handouts, press releases, etc., in our work in the field, of course, but just how extraordinarily diverse the forest is and how much it is dependent on disturbance. Anything that'll help us further that.
Sure. Well, so really the work that I have done in Correllus was in the scrub oak barrens and the forests. So I have not personally surveyed in the fire breaks, but I compiled a lot of great information that from people who have spent extensive time looking at plants in the fire breaks of Correllus. So I'm certainly happy to talk about it and get Chris Neal involved as well, and we should discuss that.
Yeah. One other question, Dan, if I might, uh, for Pat, and that is, for years I've thought of doing study plots in the midst, if you will, of the scrub oak habitat or other habitats in the forest, but off of the fire lanes per se. And we know that the fire lanes are so extraordinarily successful in the diversity because they do not have the competition of the other plants around them, and they have the light and the this and that, and they've been mowed, or not burnt, but mowed repeatedly for 100 years roughly. So they've been very well managed, and look at the results of that. So my thought for years has been, let's go out into the scrub oak or into other habitats and create monitoring plots that are managed, not just monitored, I'm sorry, but management plots that are also monitored, to see if we can create the same kind of diversity in the scrub oaks. It just sort of is trying to prove my theory that the whole darn place once looked not exactly like the fire lanes, but it had an extraordinary diversity, in my view. And if it was managed by indigenous fire, yay, that would be part of the whole thing. So that's just a thought that I have, and I wondered what, from the science standpoint, how that shakes out with you.
Sure. I mean, more experimentation and more vegetation monitoring plots, I'm never going to say no to. I think it's always a good idea to have more information available and more things explicitly studied. So again, happy to talk about that. I will say one thing is that permanently marking plots in really dense scrub oak poses some logistical challenges that would have to be addressed. It's a lot easier to find permanent plot markers in a much more open habitat than it is, even when I was going back to resurvey the Harvard Forest Survey plots from 2000, even just getting to a certain GPS point in the midst of that scrub oak is pretty challenging.
Yeah.
It can be overhead high and really dense in there. So, there would be some logistical things to consider, but I'm sure we could figure something out. Karen, hi.
Yeah, Pat did reference the one site, which we call the medicine lots, that is mowed scrub oak. And it's we just mowed it a few years ago for the first time, obviously, in a long time. And so that, I think it's sort of an outstanding question of whether the plant diversity is going to increase in there through the management that we're now doing. And so, that would be interesting to get at, I don't know, Pat, if you, when those breaks were started in the state forest relative, and how long it might have taken for grassland species to migrate into those is sort of an interesting question. And then I just also wanted to say that I think we should recognize, if we think about the larger context of the island and sea level rise, that a lot of our grasslands that we're managing are close to the ocean, and we're going to start to lose pieces of those. And so the fire breaks are going to be increasingly important for grassland species on the vineyard.
Matt.
Sorry, can I piggyback off that for 1 second?
Yeah.
So we set up these monitoring plots in the medicine lots, which are this mowed scrub oak area, in 2024. So we monitored them in 2024 and 25. But like Karen was saying, it kind of remains to be seen. More time needs to pass, I'm sure, for management effects on the plant diversity to really be noticeable.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, in response to Karen's comments and question, would it be possible, Pat, for you to go back to the slide in your presentation that showed resampling results from Katama and sampling results from the Mazar property?
Yep.
Matt, where is the Mazar property? Where's that one?
It's at the head of Kanamika Cove on the Edgartown Great Pond, so it's off of Meeting House Way. It just the Katama sites, you see level diversity curve, and in the Mazar sites in green, you see increases. And I just point out that the formal management of the Katama airfield began in 1986, and it basically continued management that had been being done informally for decades or possibly even centuries. So it makes sense that that reflects a sort of steady state. The Mazar property was the result of, was conserved as the sort of an offspring of a proposal for a golf course in that area back around the year 2000. I don't remember specifically the date, but most of that grassland restoration there was oak woodland at that point. So it is a relatively recent restoration site where the management regime changed in contrast to what happened at Katama. So it's interesting to me that the Mazar site shows in response to that restoration an increase in diversity. Whether those things are coming from the seed bank or coming from elsewhere, as you know, the propagation sources off-site is impossible to tell, and one could only speculate. But it's clear that for at least a quarter century, there can be increases in diversity in response to this kind of management regime and restoration of early successional habitat. So in terms of the medicine lots, Karen, hang tight, give it 25 years and talk to me then. It's a little bit of a different situation. I think the scrub oak that was mowed at the medicine lots was really dense and really uniform, and there wasn't much in the way of herbaceous patches inside there, although there were some. And I think the woodland at Mazar was a little bit more varied, had a little bit more like Pennsylvania sedge patches and so on that were. But I do think that this kind of restoration thing can, whether it's from seed banking or propagation from elsewhere, can take a long, long time to play out in terms of seeing the biodiversity changes. So I think this is a really great slide, Pat. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. We also, just to piggyback off of that a little bit, we also did look at, there were some native plant, native seeds and native plants planted at the site at Mazar, I think in 2003 or so, if I recall, and we actually tracked the individual species over time to see if they persisted or showed up at all or ended up making up a large proportion. The results of that are, it's not too many of the seeded or planted things really established really well over time, but there's a lot of other forb species and things that were never intentionally planted that are now showing up all over there. And yeah, it's really cool to see this. The Mazar property is this really cool mosaic of different patches and stuff. It's a cool site.
Yeah, it's been interesting following that site in terms of the invertebrate population, just watching things colonize it over time. Same kind of process that the diversity of breeding grasshoppers or breeding butterflies on the site has pretty steadily increased over the intervening years since the restoration. So really good project, and the Nature Conservancy was prescient in moving aggressively to preserve that site. The Mazar family was incredibly generous and forward-looking in cooperating with that. And then TNC and the Mazars have done a great job in managing it since the restoration. So really good example of how this can work.
Pat, can you indulge me with an elementary question that I want to ask? This is just sort of broader, but it's not. Help me understand. It's not rare species for rare species' sake, right? Like, are these are these plants pollinators? Why should we care so much about these? You know, what'd you say, 290 and change, species that are found there, and I know not too many other places, but I always ask myself that question: why should I care so much about how diminished they are? So I'll stop there because I'd like to hear from you.
Sure. It looks like Chris also wants to weigh in. I mean, right away, I think my initial response is just that, I mean, biodiversity is something that has, it's like many things in conservation or restoration, it's values based. So there's, from a kind of philosophical standpoint, just talking about biodiversity, it's like, there's something about species disappearing from the record of the planet forever, irrevocably, that I think poses ethical considerations, especially if we as humans are kind of driving a lot of those losses and extinctions, and if we could do something to prevent them. But as far as the specifics of the plants in the fire breaks in Correllus, again, I don't know personally enough about the fire breaks vegetation to weigh in about the other values of those plants, but I'm sure being a lot of them are probably flowering forb species that are work in concert with native pollinators and things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's a valid question and a valid point. It's, I think, like anything about valuing, what your values are, I guess. Chris, would you like to comment?
Yeah, can I weigh in on that? So I think that is part of it. I do think there's an ethical question to keeping things around because they exist. But on the other hand, a lot of the species that are out there, the abundant forbs, the goldenrods especially, are very, very important pollinator plants for a whole host of insects. The other issue is that I always think about biodiversity, especially with plants, is it increases adaptive capacity and ability to respond to conditions that we don't have now but might have in the future. So these plants, some of them are not abundant now, but it's very difficult for us to predict which ones will be more abundant in a world that's going to look very different in several decades. And I think keeping that adaptive capacity in the bank by preserving species, even in relatively small patches and at small abundances, has great potential value in the future for responding to conditions that will exist, and things are changing, as everybody knows, faster than they ever have in 2 or 3 million years in terms of climate. So I always think that's part of the equation for these rare species.
Appreciate that. Do other attendees have questions? I don't want to keep Patrick hostage here. So before we move on to other agenda items, figured I'd just give a chance if other folks in attendance wanted to ask any follow-up questions about the presentation. John.
How do you keep track of the expenses, either dollars or carbon, in all of your efforts going back to the year 2000 to essentially just, certainly at the Catema sites, maintain? I'm interested in how you figure out the expense, again, either in carbon or dollar, of doing what you're doing?
Yeah, we probably don't keep track as well as we should. We could probably give a pretty good guess, though, in terms of the kinds of contracts, fire contracts, and other things it takes to manage these sites. I mean, but there's a lot of overhead and staff time, that's hard to capture. But it is, it's not, obviously it takes money, particularly right now, fire is increasingly expensive if you have to hire contractors and things, so. But I don't have exact numbers.